When you go to hear someone speak, you sometimes would like to know what their credentials are for the subject that they're speaking on. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to a business conference, and I had the wonderful opportunity of hearing the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Cameron, speak, and he was a wonderful speaker. It was a great treat. So let me, maybe with that subject in mind, I'll share with you my credentials for the subject today. The subject today is we're going to be talking about failure. My friend Tim Smith, with a quick laugh, he's known me for some time. So let me give you in brief, my credentials for speaking on a subject of this nature. I'm going to limit it because we don't have too much time, but I'll just focus on what happened today. I was supposed to send to Mr. Atura, my apologies already, a copy of my notes so he could, as he worked on translating, he could get those familiarized. And I did. I did send it to him, but I sent it in a format he could not read. So about 30 minutes before I left, I got a call from Mr. Atura saying, could you send me a file that could actually open? So that was a failure of some magnitude. And then as I was finalizing my topic, I realized I'd left the scripture off the last and key verse, so I had to hurriedly do that before I walked out the door. And then I ran to the door, and I realized as we were just about to go out the door in the car, I'd forgotten my jacket. But not to worry, I ran back, got my jacket, and then I went back and realized I needed my keys. And as I run out the door, somehow I hit my arm on the side of the door, and the keys went flying about 18 feet from me. I mean, I don't even know how it's physically possible. So I think I've established my credentials for speaking on the subject of failure. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple types of failure, and we're going to use the vernacular of the day, which is fails. I think if you've ever gone on YouTube, you've probably seen a lot of videos of fails. Epic fail, as they tend to call them. So let's talk about two of those. These are not actually videos, so I'll just have to describe them to you. And they will eventually lead us to our subject for the day. So the first one I've titled, The Price Was Wrong. The story begins in 1970 in Rhode Island. A lady somehow came in contact with another person, and there was a plate for sale. And the lady looked at the plate and decided that she liked the plate, and she agreed for a price, in this case, $100 to purchase a plate. She takes the plate home. She decides, what will I do with this lovely plate that I purchased? She decided the best place to put it would be on her kitchen wall right above her stove. And there it hung for many years, acquiring layer after layer of kitchen grease from the heat of the fire below. Her children came to be familiar with this wall hanging, and it was kind of just part of the family folklore, a little bit unusual, a little funny looking. But then one day she found herself at a gallery. And as she was looking, she saw something that looked quite familiar. It looked like the picture or the hanging on her wall. She asked the person in the gallery, I have something like this at home hanging on my kitchen wall above my stove. And he said, what? He said, take that down. And he opened a book and he showed her the book. And he said, do you know what you have hanging on your wall? You have a work by Pablo Picasso. She was stunned to realize this. He told her that it was, he thought, worth about $1,000. 5 years pass. She goes on with her life. The plate stays hanging on the wall. But then she decides to go one step further. She goes to the Antique Roadshow. We've probably seen the show. She decides to have it appraised again. And they tell her, as they look at it, well, my dear, this plate is indeed a Picasso, and it is worth somewhere, conservatively speaking, $10,000 to $15,000. So for years, she had treated this thing as a common item hanging from her wall, and now, lo and behold, it's worth $15,000, perhaps, or more, $1,000. So we have a failure here to recognize value, and we're going to come back and connect that to our lives as Christians. But let's go to our second fail. This took place in the city of Boston. For some reason, these stories centered in the Northeast. This was about 28 years ago. So one evening, a couple of men dressed as police officers go knocking on the door of a museum. And the night watchman looks outside. He sees what appears to be two policemen. So, okay, let's let him in. They quickly subdue him, tie him up, and march right into the museum, and they steal $500 million worth of rare art. To this day, 28 years later, no one has been charged with the crime. It is an unsolved mystery. What we had in that occasion was a failure to protect something of value. They knew the value, a little different from the first case, but they did not protect it. All they had was a 23-year-old, a college dropout who liked rock music, and as he later would admit, getting stoned from time to time as their night watchman. No secondary line of defense. It was quite easy for the thieves to surpass that layer of security and take the valued art. So what does that have to do with us? Well, today I want to talk about our calling. And more to the point, I want to talk about how do we put a value on our calling, okay? But let me start with just examining the idea of a calling in the first place. What does it mean to be called? What does it mean to have a calling? Well, if you look at the Greek, as we sometimes do, if I can get my computer to cooperate, that would also help. We'll do it this way. So if I can't advance this, we'll be in big trouble. So calling simply means an invitation, but it's not just an invitation from anybody or to anything, even though I think anybody in this room would say it's nice to get an invitation. So our calling is an invitation. It is an invitation to join God and Jesus Christ in the family of God. If you would turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we'll read a little bit about this calling before we go into the idea of valuing it and a bit more. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1 in verse 26. There's a lot said in this verse. We've read it many times. I think sometimes we focus on half of it and not the other half. So we'll look at all of it today. Verse 26, for you see your calling, your invitation, brethren, and this is the part we focus on most often, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And I want to focus, as we go through the rest of us, look at what the purpose is. We know that we're not the wise in most cases. It does say not many, so that would imply that there are some. So there are not many. But what is our purpose? Okay? Verse 27, to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. Verse 28, and the base things of the world and things which are despised, God has chosen, and the things which are not to bring to nothing the things that are. Now, on one hand, you could look at that and say, oh, wow, he's telling me I'm a bunch of nothing. Well, that's not very encouraging. But on the other hand, he's saying we're going to be used to bring to nothing all that is mighty, all that is noble, all that is wise in this world. So let's make sure we focus on not just what could be seen as a negative, but the incredible calling that is revealed within these pages. So we've been invited to participate in that purpose. But what about the young in the audience today? And I'll let you decide if you're young or not, but I'm generally talking about the folks who are teens and maybe in early 20s. How do you see your calling? And what does it mean to be a young person in the church? Many of us have spent a lot of time as a young person in the church. But what about you? If you're here today and you hear me, if you would turn to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we'll start by looking at verse 14. This is talking about a situation where a believing spouse is married to an unbelieving spouse, but then it addresses the subject of children. So verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. So if you're holy as a child, that means you have been set apart for a purpose. And we just finished talking about a calling. So you have a purpose, and you're sitting here today, or you sit here week after week and listen to other folks preach or speak about the Word of God. So please, as we talk today, I hope that you can fight to stay interested as much as possible, because these words are available to you. This calling is available to you. So let's get back to the idea of value. The story of the plate and the story of the missing art. We're talking about $15,000 plate and $500 million of art. But what about our calling? How do you put a price on that calling? And if we wanted to take advantage of that calling, what would it cost us? Okay? Well, let's turn to the book of Galatians chapter 2. And as you, of course, know, those of you who've been around for a while, you know what the cost is. It is not insignificant. And I'll say, start by answering the question as follows. What is the cost for this calling? Our lives. Our carnal spirit, which lives in a sense, doesn't breathe, but it's alive in its own way, it's in us, it's got to die. It's got to die. And it does not want to die. Anything that has being or existence does not want to die, and it does not want to die, but it has to. So let's read verse 20, chapter 2, Galatians. Paul says a remarkable thing. I've been crucified with Christ. When did that happen? He was not on the wooden post with Jesus Christ. So how is it possible that he was crucified with Jesus Christ? Well, of course, he wasn't there that day, but by accepting the calling, he has agreed, if you will, to die, to go through a painful death of the carnal human spirit, just as Christ had to face a death. And as he says here, it is no longer I who live. We have to give up our lives. We cannot continue to live. And again, I'm talking about the carnal nature that we have within us. And he goes on to say, it is Christ that lives in me. We have the ability for the Son of God to live in us if we are able to get out of the way. And he goes on to say, in the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So the number one thing, if we want to invest in this calling, is we have to die. Our carnal spirit must die. But there's more. Once we die, then we have to become slaves. So I'm sure if you're thinking about it, if you just walked in off the street, you're like, wait a minute, I'm going to die and I'm going to become a slave. It doesn't really appeal to me. But that's what it is. If you would turn to the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, and we'll read starting at verse 5. Ephesians 6, verse 5 and 6. Bondservants, or it could be rendered slaves, someone who's been purchased to serve another person, and you have foregone your rights. You are there to do what they ask you to do. Be obedient to those who are your masters. He's talking about if you're working for somebody. Be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh. So whoever we work for, with fear and trembling. We don't normally approach work that way, probably, but that's what it says. In sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service, not just kind of pretending to, as men pleasers, but as bond servants, slaves, you could say, purchased slaves of Jesus Christ. You are doing his will, Jesus Christ first, by providing this level of service and obedience to your boss at work. Doing the will of God, as he says, from the heart. So this is the price that God has placed on our calling. We have to give up quite a bit to take advantage of this calling. Now, with that said, I want to talk about something we don't talk about maybe a lot, or at least in this way. But what's in it for us? We don't usually say it that way because we know that we are to love God. We're to be focused on God. We're to be focused on loving our brother. But what's in it for us? Is there anything in it for us, or are we just slaves? Or we just get to die? Is that all there is? Well, of course, you know that's not the case. But let's talk about what's in it for us. And the beauty of it is, by loving other people, by dying to the carnal spirit, we become godlike. And while we love others, we ourselves receive these benefits. So let's look at a couple of those. In fact, I'll just maybe phrase it in a different way. I'll ask you a question. Would you like to be fearless today? Would you like to be able to stand in the face of anything that comes your way? An army, a handful of soldiers with guns and knives. Would you like to be immortal, live forever? Would you like to be free from pain? No more pain, no aches, no ACL surgeries for those sports guys out there or gals. Less sorrow, no more death. I don't have anything to do with that. I would like to be able to experience that personally. What about this? Would you no longer like to be sitting around one day and feeling what Paul felt, what I'm sure we have all felt from time to time? Remember when he said, "O wretched man that I am, who will save me from this body of death?" How about freedom from ever feeling that again because you have become God's son? What a wonderful thing to look forward to. So that is some of the things that we look forward to. Let's go to a verse that maybe captures it in a nice summary better than any other verse I can think of anyway. If you would turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 21. Maybe you saw this one coming. So Revelation 21, we'll start reading in verse 1. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Try to imagine what that is going to be like. This earth, in many ways, is quite beautiful as it is. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. What will these new heaven and earth be like? Also, there was no more sea, and then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride. And of course, brides on their wedding days are beautifully adorned. They look as wonderful and amazing. So that's the sight we'll see as the city comes down. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them." Imagine him kind of walking around is the way I used to think about it. He will dwell with them. They shall be his people. God will be with them and be their God. And here is kind of the punchline, if you will. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Will he do that like that? I don't know. There shall be no more death, as we just talked about. There'll be no more sorrow. Nothing, no broken relationships, no lost loved ones, no frustrated plans. None of that. It's gone. No more crying. No more pain. No more injuries. No more sickness. It's gone. So those are the things that we have to look forward to. And not only that, if you turn to the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 15, these are not, of course, new scriptures. A man long ago used to speak in this church once said, when someone complained after services, why don't you ever talk about any new scriptures? And he said, he was a British gentleman, he said, I can't duplicate it, but he said, ma'am, I'd be more than happy to speak from new scriptures if only some had been written, but none have been written for over 2,000 years, so we'll have to go with what I have. So these are familiar, but again, they're still very powerful and important. So 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50, now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does corruption inherit incorruption. Behold, I tell a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. The trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised incorruptible. We've talked about this in recent days on the last great day. We shall all be changed, and trumpets as well. This corruptible must put on incorruption, this mortal put on immortality, never to die. So when this corruptible, if I can talk, and I think that's speaking to both the physical and the carnal natures that we wrestle with. When it's put on incorruption and the mortal is put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass in death, as the saying that's written, death is swallowed up in victory. And one last scripture on this note, the value, the benefit, if you will, to us. What we'll be able to enjoy. 1 John 4, verse 18. There are a lot of amazing scriptures in the Bible. This is one of my personal favorites. 1 John 4, verse 18. There is no fear, none whatsoever, in love. If you want to become fearless, if I want to become fearless, I have to learn how to love the way God loves. If I do that, I'm going to be okay. And he talks about, but perfect love, in fact, casts out fear. It gets rid of fear. If we want to become fearless, we're going to have to become perfect at loving other people. He goes on to say that fear involves torment. And I think any of us, if we're anxious, if we're fearful of something, we are tormented. And it's not a very pleasant thing to experience. So again, something to look forward to in the future, and even in our lives today. We can progress and grow in this if we are able to yield to God. So there's the benefit to us. We've talked about the cost. It does certainly involve a cost. But now let's switch back to kind of one of the earlier subjects I touched on briefly. The folks here in the audience today, myself included, I'm going to say the young and the not so young, as I said before, and we could just be maybe blunt and say the baptized and the not yet baptized. For those of you who are younger and perhaps are considering, or maybe you've not even considered baptism, I'd like to encourage you, as you are involved in the process of, quote, recognizing value, I'd like to encourage you to remember this. Look at the back of the plate. What do I mean by that? Well, I didn't tell you, but going back to the story of the Picasso plate, it turns out that in the middle of this Antiques Roadshow event, that the appraiser, the expert, was looking at the plate, the ceramic plate, and just explaining it to the lady, the owner. He turns it around, And guess what was on the very back of the plate? An embossed word that said Picasso. She had never seen it, apparently. It had been hanging. She simply looked at the front of it, put it on the wall, and there it sat for, I think, around 15 or more years. So it was evident. It should have been evident to her if she had only spent a little more time and looked at it. So for those of you who are younger, if you would, and of course we all can turn here because it also applies to us. It can be of great instruction and value to us. If you would turn to the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 18 through 20. We often read this when we're talking about people in the world, but there's a message there for all of us as well. Romans 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. By the way, let me put a plug in. For those of you who would like to learn about people who are explicitly suppressing the truth, Dr. Tom Kirkpatrick at the Feast in Rapid City spoke on this subject on Youth Day. It's probably posted to the Cogwell website, but he talks about this very thing. So there are those who are absolutely trying to suppress truth. But let's go on. Verse 19, because what may be known of God, and here's the focus, is manifest or apparent in them, for God has shown it to them, like the back of that plate. It was there. It is there. Verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. So as we deal with all the stuff that comes our way, the atheists, the evolutionary scientists, the intelligentsia, the whoever that are out there, it tells us right here that if we spend time looking at the things that God made, we can see him. So let's claim that promise. Let's study. Let's learn about what he's made. And God tells us right here, it will become manifest who the Creator is. Let's then switch to the idea of protecting value. For those of us who've been baptized for many years, I'm sure that we all could tell our war stories of how we've had our good days, our bad days, maybe a good year and a bad year, maybe more, maybe some bad years. Let's go to what some instruction the Bible provides, or some reminders that the Bible provides to us. Revelation, chapter 3, verse 10. Because you've kept my command to persevere, talking to the churches, or the church here, I will also keep you from the hour of trial. So trial is coming, which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. In verse 11, behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. So there's a warning, there's an admonition being given here. And if you look at the Greek behind hold fast, maybe sometimes it doesn't maybe strike us in today's language, it means that you need to have power. You need to have a powerful grip on what you have. And that power cannot come from us. It absolutely cannot come from us. We will not make it. It can only come from God. And so we have to be connected to God and allow him to provide that power so we can do that. But he recognizes if we don't, someone can take our crown. Let's move then to the book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. This verse has always seemed like a bit of a riddle to me. I think maybe I know what it's saying, so I'll give you my quote opinion. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. And I, in the past, I kind of tried to think about this and ask myself, well, do I think I stand? Am I in the faith? Am I trying to please God? And oftentimes I would think, well, I think I am. I think I'm doing okay. I'm trying to do A, B, and C, right? So what does that mean? Because he says, if you think that way, then you need to take heed. Well, I think the point simply is this. It's not so much that you can't think that or you shouldn't think that, but if you do think that, that's a time, it's a reminder, okay, I think that, but I better take heed. I better make sure that I've got my plan in place, and unlike the folks at the museum in Boston, I've got a plan to thwart the invader. Otherwise, then perhaps we may fall. And he goes on to talk about temptations that will come upon us all, but God will make a way of escape so that we will be able to bear it. So there is a way to escape, there is a way to bear it, but we need to take heed whenever we hear these words. In Hebrews chapter 2, we'll take another look at another scripture with a similar thought or admonition. Hebrews 2, starting in verse 1. Therefore we must give the more earnest heed, here's that word again, heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. Some years ago, Mr. Frank spoke on the subject of some men, I believe in Georgia, who were fishing near a spillway, again, I think in Georgia, and they got too close to the spillway in their boat, and they really weren't paying attention, and the pull of the water began to pull them toward the spillway, and they could not paddle. I don't know if they had paddle. I can't remember the rest of the story. They had paddles or whatever. They could not resist the force. It pulled them over the spillway, and unfortunately, as I recall, I believe, to their death. So this is talking about drifting. They were drifting away to some place of danger. So again, the admonition for those of us who have placed a value, have accepted that call to make sure that we're taking heed. And finally, as we begin to wrap up here today, going back to our story with the Picasso plate, the lady went on this show or this gathering, this antique road show. She went there for the express purpose of going to see an appraiser, someone with knowledge, someone who could tell her what that plate was indeed worth. We've already heard what I think we could call the master appraiser, we've already heard what his word tells us our calling is worth. But of course, he's not the only appraiser in town. The other appraiser of town, of course, is Satan and his angels, and they are constantly broadcasting, we've talked a little bit about that before, they are constantly broadcasting a different message. They are saying our calling is not worth it. You should not die. You should not become a slave. That's for fools and weak people. You need to go out there and use your mind. You need to be a smart person. You need to get advanced degrees. You need to get with the people. That's what you need to do. And that's just one of the stories. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2, if you would please. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2. And you, God, or Jesus Christ, made alive who were dead. So we were all dead in trespasses and sin, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit, so it's a spirit, which now works in the sons of disobedience. So when we disobey, which we sometimes do, we can allow the Spirit into our hearts, and that, of course, is not a good thing. And it is espoused, if you will, it is promoted by the prince of the power of the air. Let's then ask this question. We're going to set it in the vernacular of the time, what's going on in the world here today. Here's the question. Who do we listen to? Because you can ask yourself, what am I valuing? And one way you can do that is to say, well, who am I listening to? Who do I believe in? Who do I follow? And let's put it in the context of today. What's on your playlist? For those of you who really love music, I went online, I looked at Spotify, so many of you know what Spotify is, but they curate these playlists of all sorts of different kinds of music. I am not endorsing any of these. I confess I've not spent a lot of time looking at them, but there's a short list of some of the names of their playlists. Most Necessary, Anti-Pop, If It Weren't for Gucci, Freeform, Rep Caviar, Cali Fire. There's a few of the playlists that people have on their phones or their devices, and maybe someone in this room has one of those on their phone. I'm not condemning, but it is something that gets in your head. How much time do you spend listening to that? What about this question? Who do you follow? Of course, 20 years ago, that might have meant something else, but today you could follow people, of course, on Twitter. You can follow people on Instagram. The most popular people on Twitter, according to my Google research of 2 minutes, are Katy Perry, the Beeb, Justin Bieber, former President Barack Obama, Rihanna, and Taylor Swift. So these people are very popular. They are being followed by millions of people. Do you follow them? Well, you might. Maybe you like their music, but do you really follow them? And do you really listen? Speaking of listening, what about talk radio? Last 20, I don't know, maybe 30 years, talk radio has become a staple in this world. Who are the top radio personalities in the U.S.? Again, more Google research tells us that Sean Hannity, apparently, by some measure, is number one. Rush Limbaugh has held that title for years and years, apparently, but according to what I read, Sean Hannity has somehow surpassed him. And you look at the list, there's a lot of conservative talk show hosts. There's also Howard Stern, for those of you who are for those with a slightly different view. But those are some of the people that people listen to all the time. So the subject, again, is who do you listen to, and the subject is who do you follow. If you would turn, and we're almost done, John chapter 6, verse 63. Hope I'm not going over time here. John 6, verse 63. One of the most, I know I always say this, and I think the reality is every verse in the Bible is incredible, so I should probably stop saying it. But John 6, verse 63, Christ is speaking here, and he said, "It is the Spirit which gives life. The flesh," we're sitting here today covered in flesh, "the flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit." The words in the gospel, words repeated by the apostles, they are spirit, and they are life. We believe that. Sometimes it's maybe hard to believe it. But they're actually God's Spirit. If we ingest those words, they become us. We become filled with God's Spirit, and we gain life. So who are we listening to? What words? These words are the words we should be listening to predominantly. Matthew chapter 16, please. Matthew 16 in verse 24. So it turns out, as you might imagine, the idea of following someone, I think I already said this, isn't new. And we find this spoken of back in the days of Christ and the apostles. Matthew 16, verse 24. Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So there again, we must die. Our carnal spirit must die. So there you have it. We've looked at a couple of ways to fail in terms of valuing things. We can fail to recognize the value of our calling, or we can get maybe a little complacent, and we can not have in place sufficient protection, because Satan will come. He will come to take our crown, and he may come at a point we think we're doing okay. We've looked at some benefits of our calling. I hope that was encouraging. And I'd like to finish with one final verse, which I think was read at the feast this year, and I find this a really encouraging and inspiring verse. And this is the one I forgot to write the verse down before I left, almost. But if you would turn to the book of 2 Kings, 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 14. If you ever have a bad day or week or month or year, and even now you might want to stop and think about this. 2 Kings 6, verse 14. "Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city." So the Syrians are surrounding the people of God. Not a good thing. They have swords, they have javelins, they have some sort of clubs, they have knives, and they intend to use them. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was that army surrounding the city with these horses and those chariots. And his servant said to him, "Alas," I'm pretty sure it didn't say alas, but that's how it's translated, "Alas, my master, what shall we do? We're surrounded here. This is not good." And so he answered, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And I'm sure the servant said, "Have you lost your mind?" And Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." And then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And we know the rest of the story. The Syrian army is defeated. They're struck, as Elisha has prayed, with blindness. And God's people were spared, and they were given the victory. So when you have those bad days, or even now, just in maybe a normal day, ask yourself, do you see what we're surrounded by? Do we see the army of God? Do we see those chariots of fire? If we do, I think it will be very encouraging. It can help us to value our calling and avoid failure.